globalization. Its main theme is set working people against one another, so that it'll naturally follow that wages are lowered, benefits decline, working conditions are harmed, the environment is destroyed. It's a problem for our grandchildren. We don't worry about it. But there are tremendous privileges for management, for their colleagues in the poor countries, and so on. For example, one component of these agreements is what's called national treatment. It means that if, say, General Motors invests in Mexico, they have to be treated like a Mexican company. In fact, even better than a Mexican company, because the treatment of General Motors has to meet the international trade conditions. Mexican companies, they don't have to. So they have to be treated better than Mexican companies. In contrast, if a Mexican comes to the United States, a Mexican of flesh and blood, he can't demand national treatment, obviously. Try that, you end up in Guantanamo if you're lucky. But corporations are different. They have the rights of persons granted to them by state power, but rights far beyond those of persons, and again, granted by state power. The so-called free trade agreements extend those rights in numerous ways. Well, what all of this means for the so-called developing countries is straightforward. It's intended to lock them in to their current state of underdevelopment by barring the growth strategies that were used by the currently rich countries, the developed countries, to reach their present state. Now, there's a name for it in economic theory, in economic history. It's called kicking away the ladder. At first you climb up the ladder of development yourself, and then you kick it away. You make sure that nobody else can use the measures that you use to climb to the top. And the measures are protection of domestic industries, targeted investments, reliance on the state sector for research and development, for production, for procurement, and a whole bunch of other devices that were, in fact, the devices that were used by every one of the currently rich countries to reach its present state. So now, of course, they want to kick away the ladder. It's called free trade. You can just, what the poor countries, the developing countries are supposed to do is to pursue a comparative advantage. It's supposed to be a wonderful thing. The problem is that development means changing comparative advantage, not pursuing. Development is changing your comparative advantage to a different comparative advantage. So take, say, the history of the United States, say right after it won independence. Suppose it had followed the advice and pursued its comparative advantage in exporting fur and fish and so on. Well, the scattered population that would live here today would be doing that. Or maybe they'd have maquiladoras if they were lucky for England or Germany or someone. But they didn't pursue their comparative advantage. They didn't follow the rules. What they did is erect very high tariffs, first around New England, where the Industrial Revolution began, then elsewhere, to prevent superior British textiles from coming in. Later, superior British steel and superior industrial machinery and so on. That way, the United States was able to change its comparative advantage and become the world's leading industrial society. In the 19th century, right up to the mid-20th century, the United States was far in the lead in protectionism, violating all the rules radically, more so, far more so, in fact, than the other industrial countries. And it had the highest growth rate. In fact, that's pretty consistent throughout history. So consistent that one of the leading economic historians, Paul Baruch, has actually concluded that protectionism enhances trade. It sounds kind of like a paradox, but it seems to work and has a rationale. Protectionism increases growth, and growth increases trade. So protectionism seems to enhance trade. And that conclusion, incidentally, holds into the post-Second World War period, when other forms of market interference, which I'll talk about in a minute, became more prominent. The United States, by pursuing not only protectionist policies but reliance on the state sector for production and development, it became by far the world's leading economic power. By around 1950, the United States literally had half of the total wealth of the world. Quite never anything like that in history. And in 1950, U.S. tariffs were still higher than those of today's developing countries, the ones that they are being instructed they must reduce, as economic theory proves, to lock them into their current state of underdevelopment. It's only one of many examples, and it's one of the reasons why quite a number of leading development economists urge the failure of the Doha round, current trade negotiations, because it might be an opportunity for the vast failure would be an opportunity for the vast majority of the world's population to escape being locked into the existing international division of labor. Actually, I'm quoting the chief economist of UNCTAD, the UN Agency of Economic Analysis and Policy, and he's far from alone. Well, that's been true through history. As I said, by 1950, the United States had become the richest, most powerful state in history. U.S.-based corporations and the state that they largely control, that caters to their interests, at that point were willing to sponsor a limited version of free trade, knowing that to use the standard metaphor, the playing field was not level, that's no good, tilted in the right direction. They were going to win, so maybe free trade would be okay. But that commitment was hedged with crucial restrictions to ensure that the powerful would prevail. The most extreme restriction, which is rarely discussed by economists, is reliance on the dynamic state sector as the engine of growth. It covers practically everything. Computers, the internet, containers, lasers, commercial aircraft, just run across the board, and you find that the state sector was critical in developing them. In the case of computers and the internet, they were basically in the state sector for about 30 years before they were handed over to private power. It's not what you learn in economics courses, but it's the way the world works. And it makes a lot of sense when research and development and production and procurement are in the state sector. It means the public's paying for it. So the public is paying the costs and taking the risks. And if something finally works out, maybe 30 years later, as in the case of computers and the internet, you hand it over to private power to make profit. That's known as market societies, free markets, capitalism. It's the way it really works. And it's nothing new. The United States didn't invent it. So if you look at our predecessor in global dominance, namely England, it's exactly the way they handled it. In 1846, England shifted to free trade. It's supposed to be wonderful. But there's a footnote. It was after 150 years of protectionism, state intervention, and imperial violence, which had placed England far in the lead in industrialization, about twice as high per capita as any other country. So it seemed that competition would be relatively safe, like for the U.S. a century later. But like the U.S., the British hedged their bets. They kept protected markets, like India was kept as a protected market to ensure profit. One of the reasons for conquering India was another form of market interference. They were trying to monopolize opium production, one of the main reasons for the conquest of India. They didn't quite make it. The Yankee merchants got a piece of it. But the British came pretty close to monopolizing opium production, and that was extremely important because England was unable to break into the Chinese market.